For joining us for today's webinar, Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy, What Farmers Need to Know, hosted by the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership and one of our partners or members, University of Illinois Extension. My name is Helen Van Beck. I am a program manager with American Farmland Trust, and I manage the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership. So we have a lot to cover, so we're just going to dive right in today. But before we jump in, just a few housekeeping things. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop those in the chat, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the call. So we'll make sure to run through those then, but I encourage you to use that. And then we're also going to share a lot of resources throughout the presentation. So my colleague Rachel Lechuga will be dropping in links into the chat as they're mentioned. But if you don't grab them all, don't worry. We're going to send out a list of relevant links following the presentation as well. So I wanted to start off today by introducing the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership, or ISAP, and talking a little bit about what our role is and why we're concerned with the nutrient loss reduction strategy. So ISAP is a nonprofit organization. We have 15 members. And we're working collaboratively to promote whole system conservation solutions focused on soil health and nutrient and water management to reduce nutrient losses and meet sustainability goals. ISAP formed in 2017 in response to the passage of the NLRS in 2015. And the founding members really understood that our efforts would be stronger if we worked together to leverage our resources and share clear and consistent messaging for farmers and farm advisors. So after our founding in 2017, ISAP developed its theory of change in 2020. And this still really guides our work today of our 3 core strategies, which include helping farmers recognize the economic value of conservation practices, serving as a clearinghouse for soil health and conservation drainage education, and accelerating the adoption of conservation practices that improve soil health, the carbon cycle balance, and water quality. And with those strategies in mind, we are working towards our desired impact or our long-term goal, which is Illinois agriculture voluntarily meeting the goals that are established in the nutrient loss reduction strategy and benefiting from being part of the climate solution. So as an organization, the nutrient loss reduction strategy goals is kind of our North Star of what we're trying to help farmers and farm advisors address. And our role in this space is really providing resources for soil health networks, outreach, and education. We coordinate field days and other educational events around these practices. We provide expertise through our collaborative partnerships and also the specific expertise of our members. And we see ourselves as a platform for disseminating relevant research. So we work with a lot of researchers in Illinois to understand the most up-to-date research and help communicate that to farmers and farm advisors. And just at a glance here, ISAP has 15 members, as I mentioned. So here's sort of a visual of what our membership looks like. We have a few members who are sort of in that sort of traditional conservation area of the Nature Conservancy and the Wetlands Initiative. We have a few commodity groups, so the Soybean Association, Corn Growers, Midwest Dairy. We also work with educational groups, so Illinois Extension, Illinois Central College. And then we have a few groups who are working more on the sort of installation and construction of edge field practices. And we're joined today by one of our members, the University of Illinois Extension, who serves as the sort of leading organization for the coordination of the nutrient loss reduction strategy. So I'll pass it over to Rachel Curry. She'll introduce herself and then give an overview of the NLRS and the 2023 Biennial Report. And then I'll jump back in towards the end to talk more about what ISAP is doing to help out.
Well, thank you, Helen. So as she mentioned, the Illinois Extension is part of ISAP, and for those of you who aren't familiar with Illinois Extension, the University of Illinois Extension is an outreach and engagement organization that brings together research-based information and education to individuals, families, and communities. It leverages the resources and expertise of the University of Illinois to address various needs and challenges by fostering learning and development across the state. So over the last year or so, our Illinois Extension NLRS team has really grown. So I'm going to introduce you to some of the people going from left to right and top to bottom. Now, the Illinois Extension team is being led by Dr. Travis Burke, who is the Assistant Dean and Program Lead for the Ag and Agribusiness team, and Dr. Shibu Kar, who is the Assistant Dean and Program Lead for the Natural Resources, Environment, and Energy team, as well as Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. I am a statewide ag and watershed extension educator, and I focus on the nutrient loss reduction strategy, and I'm part of what we refer to as the watershed implementation team. And so that team includes 2 watershed outreach associates. We have Nicole Haberback, who serves 2 nitrogen priority watersheds, the Lower Rock and the Mississippi North Central watershed, and Emma Eldridge, who just joined our team last week. She serves 2 phosphorus priority watersheds, the Embra and the Little Wabash. And I'll show a map here in a few slides showing you exactly where those watersheds are located. We also have Joan Cox, who is the Extension NLRS Program Manager, and she is part of the facilitation team along with Amanda Christensen and Emily Steele. And then we have a stormwater team, which includes Eliana Brown and Lane Kanoki. Next slide, please. So before I get into the nutrient loss reduction strategy, I think it's important that we all understand what exactly is hypoxia. So hypoxia just means low oxygen. And one of the leading causes is excess nutrients. And when we're talking about that, we're primarily talking about nitrogen and phosphorus. And so these nutrients promote algal growth and eventually overgrowth. Now, once these excess nutrients are used up, or the season changes, then the algae die off, and their decomposition uses up an enormous amount of oxygen. So they're taking that oxygen out of the water. One of the reasons that we try and mitigate nutrient loss is the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. But it's really important to realize that algal blooms are also a local problem. And these algal blooms in our local watersheds impact our drinking water safety, as well as can result in the closing of recreational sites. So if you enjoy going boating or fishing or swimming or anything that has to do with water, algal blooms can impact your ability to enjoy those. So NOAA actually measures the size and the shape of the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico annually. And the most recent report of the hypoxic zone was released on August 3rd of 2023. And the hypoxic zone was measured at a little over 3,000 square miles. So another way of thinking about that, that's nearly the same size as Yellowstone National Park. Or another way to think about it is that that's almost 2 million acres of habitat that's potentially unavailable to fish and bottom species. And you might notice the dark red zones that are outlined in black, and those are regions that are contain less than 2 milligrams per liter of oxygen. And so what that means is that those areas are completely uninhabitable to marine life. So anything that can't leave will suffocate. Now, the size and the shape of the hypoxic zone change, and these measurements are just a snapshot in time. There's a lot of variables that play a factor in this, and that they include nutrient loss, precipitation, and other weather patterns like hurricanes, just to name a few. So this is a big problem. Covers a large area, right? The Mississippi River Basin covers about 41% of the contiguous US. So you may stop and ask yourself, why in Illinois should we care about what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico? Well, I'm hoping these next couple slides will help illustrate that. This is a map that was part of a report to Congress that was delivered in March of 2022 by the Gulf of Mexico Hypoxia Task Force. And it shows the distribution of total nitrogen yields delivered to the Gulf from the Mississippi rivers. And so this is an estimate, but you can see that Illinois is in the dark green color, and that indicates that Illinois is a large contributor of total nitrogen to the Mississippi River and eventually to the Gulf of Mexico. So again, this is the same map, same model, same report, but we're looking at total phosphorus instead. And so the darker brown colors indicate higher amounts of phosphorus, and Illinois is again in those darker brown colors, which indicate that Illinois is also a large contributor of total phosphorus. Now, I'm going to pause and give you something else to consider. We're talking about nutrient loss as an environmental issue, but it's also an economic issue. Fertilizer is expensive, as are all inputs. So you want to keep your fertilizer and all of your inputs in your field where you can get a return on that investment. So a little more background on how we got to the nutrient loss reduction strategy. So the hypoxia task force was developed in response to the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and they created an action plan that was released in 2008. And within that, it outlines our ultimate reduction goals. Now, the US EPA tasked the 12 highest contributing states to create strategies on how to address nitrogen and phosphorus losses from their state. And then the Stoner memo was released, and that was to provide a framework for each state to create their own strategy. And it included some minimum building blocks and some framework on the elements that the US EPA believed were necessary for a good nutrient reduction strategy. And so Illinois' nutrient loss reduction strategy was created in response to those, and the original strategy was composed by a large group of partners across the state and was released in 2015. But it's also important to realize that the nutrient loss reduction strategy is a living document, and it's updated and expanded every 2 years through biennial reports. So the 2023 biennial report and executive summary were released in December of 2023 and are available on the Illinois EPA website. So our NLRS looks at 3 primary sources or sectors. We have point sources, urban stormwater, and agriculture. And our NLRS has 2 primary goals: to reduce the nutrient pollution that leaves Illinois via the Mississippi River, and to improve local water quality of streams, rivers, lakes for Illinois residents. So the Illinois strategy set an interim and long-term goals to reduce nutrients that leave the state and contribute to the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So our interim goals are to reduce 15% of our nitrate nitrogen losses and 25% of total phosphorus by 2025. And we have our long-term goal of reducing total nitrogen and total phosphorus by 45%. Now, the strategy does not call for new regulation. Instead, it outlines approaches to meet community and industry needs while reducing negative impacts on nutrient loss on the environment, industry, and public health. So stakeholder partners from across the state work to implement the strategy's recommendations. These numbers break down where the nutrients are coming from by the different sources. And these numbers are from the original strategy. So when we're looking at that, ag contributes about 80% of the nitrogen losses and about 48% of the phosphorus losses. Now, it may come as a surprise that almost half of the phosphorus loss in Illinois comes from our wastewater treatment facility point sources. But there is discussion surrounding updating these numbers for the 2025 report. So I mentioned priority watersheds a little bit earlier, but here's a little bit more information. So the priority watersheds were identified using total phosphorus and nitrate nitrogen loading data from the science assessment in the original strategy, as well as information on local water quality conditions and knowledge of watershed-based planning infrastructure. The outlined watersheds are the watersheds that could make the greatest impact on nutrient loss here in Illinois. So the blue watersheds are nitrogen priority watersheds, and the orange are the phosphorus priority watersheds. So the nitrogen priority watersheds are in the central and northern part of the state. And that's because nitrate moves really easily with water, and much of the tile drain lands are in the central and northern part of the state. Phosphorus is different. Phosphorus adheres really tightly to soil. So as soil moves through erosion, phosphorus also moves. So that's why we have the phosphorus priority watersheds in the region of the state where we have more of the rolling topography. And I mentioned the watershed outreach associates And the gold stars on the map indicate the watersheds that are served by Extension Watershed Outreach Associates. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the 2023 Biennial Report. And this is looking at the statewide numbers. So our statewide water yield or river flow has increased significantly since the baseline. It's up 23%. And that's partially due to the high precipitation in 2019 and 2020, along with higher precipitation years overall. Now, starting around 2000, we started to see the phosphorus levels were going up, and we've seen a continuation of that trend. And so currently they're up 35% from the baseline, despite the gains that we've seen in phosphorus reductions from our wastewater treatment plants and the increased agricultural conservation practice adoption. Now, nitrate has increased as well, but that can partially be explained. The increase in precipitation contributes to nitrate loss. Now, greater runoff and drainage may have caused some of the increase in nutrient loads. However, you will see that there are factors other than precipitation, runoff, and drainage that contribute to the changes in the nutrient loads. This graph examines the 8 major rivers in Illinois that are monitored by the USGS super gauges, and this is part of the 2023 Biennial Report. Now, if precipitation, runoff, and drainage were the only causes, then the changes in nutrient loads would be more evenly distributed across the watersheds than what's indicated by these data. And relative to the 1980 through 96 baseline, which is that red line, the largest increase in nitrate nitrogen occurred in the Illinois portion of the Rock River, and that may be partially due to interactions with the aquifer as well as legacy nitrogen. So overall, we are still above the baseline, but we are seeing a decrease when we're correcting for stream flow. Now, improvements can be attributed to better plant genetics, the optimization of nitrogen fertilizer use and nutrient management, and the overall, there's a lot of variability amongst these rivers. Okay, and this slide, we're looking at total phosphorus. And again, there's a lot of variability among the rivers. The Illinois River watershed has the highest loads, but it's also the largest watershed. And we've seen the greatest increase in phosphorus loads that occurred in the Kaskaskia and the Little Wabash, but the increase in loads is not proportional to the increase in stream flow. And the reason for that has not yet been investigated. Now, scientists know that precipitation and runoff do not completely explain these phosphorus levels, so more research is needed on other contributing factors like legacy phosphorus and stream bank erosion. Now, I've talked about all the problems, and we have a ways to go to meet our goals, but what can be done? Well, this is the most up-to-date list of approved agricultural conservation practices that are part of the NLRS. Now, each practice has an identified expected nutrient reduction percentage, as well as an estimated cost per acre per year. Now, several of these in-field practices also support soil health, like reduced tillage and cover crops. There are also edge of field practices and land use changes that are part of the NLRS. So edge of field practices are implemented at the boundary of a field and typically don't require land to be taken out of production. However, land use change would be taking less productive ground out of row crop production and transitioning it to a perennial or energy crop. And you can learn more about these practices by going to the Illinois Extension Nutrient Loss Reduction website to check out the podcast or blog, and you can also read through the fact sheet, which contains these tables. As part of the original strategy, the NLRS put together some different scenarios on possible ways to reach our goals. So this is just one of those possible scenarios, and I want to highlight that practice adoption has increased, especially when we're looking at nutrient management. However, overall, there's still room for improvement in some of the other ag conservation practices like cover crops. And this is just one of the scenarios in which we could potentially reach our final goals. So the navy bar is for the implementation level needed for the practice to reach our reduction goal for this scenario. And the orange bar is the implementation level as of 2021, 2022. So again, we are seeing progress that's being made to with some of these practices, but again, there's still a need for increased adoption. Now, ag conservation implementation is not inexpensive. So there are several cost share opportunities on the federal and state levels to consider as you think about implementing more conservation on your land. So as vital as these cost share programs are for ag, they offer a way for part of the practice to be paid for to relieve some of the burden from farmers. But in the 2023 report, we looked at the backlog due to lack of funding for these programs, as well as lack of personnel to install these practices. And so when we're looking at the Conservation Stewardship Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, they had a backlog of more than $60 million in 2022 alone, with over 1,400 unfunded applications. We've also seen an increase above baseline for water yield or flow, and that impacts nutrient loads. So monitoring data illustrates that nutrient loads are above the baseline values. But when we're normalizing for water flow, nutrient loads are decreasing overall, but we still have a lot of work to do. There's also a lot of uncertainty surrounding legacy nutrients and stream bank erosion, there's ongoing research that are trying to find some of these answers. And despite significant investment and effort, nutrient loss attributed to the non-point sector, including agriculture, are still above the baseline. But the levels of conservation practice adoption have increased in some cases, but not at the pace or scale that's needed to meet our NLRS 2025 interim goals. And as I wrap up, I just want to give you a snapshot of the different organizations that have been supportive of the NLRS and that are working together to meet its goals. Now, many of them have representatives on the NLRS policy working group, as well as advise on the NLRS biennial reports. So these organizations and so many more contribute data to the biennial report to showcase how we are working together to move the strategy forward here in Illinois. And it's really exciting to see so many diverse groups come together to meet a common goal. And I also just want to highlight the industry has really stepped up to help farmers meet their nutrient loss goals. Now, I know this is a lot of information, but I'm going to pass it back to Helen to talk about the resources that are available to farmers through ISAP and on the ISAP webpage.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, and just encourage everyone again, keep putting questions in the chat and we'll get to those towards the end. Yes, but as Rachel just mentioned, this is a lot of information. There's a lot of information and charts and numbers in both the strategy and all of the biennial reports that have come out. And as someone who has spent time digging through those, I know it's a lot to take in. So ISAP has tried to synthesize some of that information into a single 2-pager for farmers and farm advisors, which you can find on our website. And I think Rachel Chuga is going to drop a link in the chat here. The 2-pager includes some key findings from the report, and it also provides kind of a status update on nutrient loads statewide and the scale of practice adoption. And then some suggestions for the big question, what can farmers do to help? So just to reiterate some of the key findings from the 2023 report, that Illinois is not on track to meet the interim goals that were established for us in 2025, especially in the non-point sector. And as Rachel's data showed, the monitoring data is showing that the loads are above the baseline values rather than in the 15% or 25% reduction levels. And yeah, the levels of conservation practice adoption has increased in some cases, which Rachel also showed, but it's not increasing at the pace or scale that's needed to meet the targets. So the big question, what can farmers do? ISAP has developed this kind of framework for farmers to think about this that sort of follows these 3 steps around reflect, learn, and take action. So the 2-pager includes some of these kind of guiding questions for you to think about and kind of analyze your farm. You know your farm better than anyone else does. And while we are going to need conservation on every acre across the state, the conservation will look different on every acre across the state as well. So we know that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So the first step is really for farmers to think about what you're currently doing, what challenges you're experiencing on your farm, and where there might be opportunities for change. After you've done your reflection, then we suggest doing some learning as the next step. So we'd encourage people to attend a soil health or conservation drainage training. ISAP's website hosts an event calendar with upcoming field days and learning opportunities. And we also host a resource library where you can learn more about these practices and the impacts that they have on both on nutrient loss and soil health. And we send a monthly newsletter called The Aggregate, which includes an overview of some of the upcoming events. So it's a great place where everything is kind of consolidated to see upcoming events. We also suggest that people join our Illinois Cover Crop on Farm Network, or ICON calls. These are monthly discussions that ISAP hosts around a variety of cover crop topics. We host them on Zoom. And if you miss a call, we do publish a recap blog on our website, and we also record and post the recordings on our YouTube channel. So there's a good directory there of cover crop related topics if people want to learn more about cover crops. Right now, we're in the middle of our spring series, probing into soil health tests, trying to understand which test is best. So in February, we were joined by Dr. Patrick Fries talking about the Haney soil health test. And next week on the 13th, we'll be joined by Robert Schindelbeck to talk about the Cornell soil health test. And then in April, David Kleinschmidt, who's a consultant in Illinois, will be talking about how farmers should be using the results of these soil health tests to make decisions on the farm. So that's a great resource, and you can network with other people in the state who are also learning about cover crops and using them on their farms. We also encourage farmers to look at some of ISAP's resources. Specifically, an introduction to soil health practices is a 30-page guidebook that ISAP released this fall. The guidebook includes technical advice and how conservation practices can help address agronomic challenges in the field. We look at soil properties and function, weed management and pest control, and nutrient efficiencies. The guidebook also includes scientific research that's been done in Illinois and highlights 6 farmers in Illinois who are finding success by using these practices. So it's a great way to read how these practices are being incorporated across the state and get some good information on how the practices can help address some of the challenges that you might be experiencing in your field. And we're actually hosting a webinar later this week, digging in a little bit deeper into this resource on Thursday. So I encourage people to sign up and join us for that. Then after you've attended a training or you've done some research around some resources, then we really encourage farmers to take action. So one thing farmers can do is fill out their STAR form to assess soil and nutrient loss management practices. If you're not familiar with the STAR program, it's Saving Tomorrow's Agricultural Resources. It's a simple and free tool that farmers can use to sort of evaluate their fields. It's a one-page front and back questionnaire, or there's also a web app that you can fill out on either on your computer or on your phone. And you answer a few questions about what kind of practices you're using in your fields. Then you get a star rating of 1 to 5 stars. And it's a really great, simple way to see how you kind of compare to the average farmer in Illinois. And also what practices you could adopt in order to help improve your STAR score and improve the conservation on your field. It's a voluntary program, but if you do participate, there's access to additional incentives, including the Partners for Conservation state cost share program. Yes, and I think Rachel is trying to add links as fast as I'm running through these, so there should be a link to the STAR website in the chat as well. We also encourage people to find local experts who can help them with this transition to adopting conservation practices. And in order to kind of address this need, ISAP launched a conservation story map a couple of years ago. And so we encourage people to find specialists on the map, or if you're a farmer in the audience or you're a local expert in the audience, we encourage you to create a profile and share your own expertise. Here's a little visual of what the story map looks like, and this is hosted on our website. It features farmers, service providers, and ISAP specialists, as well as demonstration sites and research across the state who are looking at conservation practices. And so each pin on the map includes a profile of that resource, as well as contact information. And here you can see John Pike's profile. So this is on the ISAP Specialist Network sort of tab. So these are all people who work closely with our programs or have gone through our soil health training or a conservation drainage program. So we encourage you to use the map, find somebody who's in your area, either a specialist, a service provider, or a farmer. Everyone who's listed on the map is willing to share their expertise and can either provide advice or services to support your conservation adoption. And again, if you're a farmer who's had success with these practices and you're interested in sharing your story, or if you're an expert and you would like to help people in your area find success with these practices, we are encouraging people to add their own pin to the map, which you can do on the website. And it's just a quick and simple form to fill out as well. We also are encouraging farmers to evaluate incentive opportunities for cover crops and edge of field practices. So as Rachel mentioned, some of these practices are not cheap to implement. And so ISAP has developed a couple incentive directories to help farmers understand what kind of incentive payments are available to them in their area. So we have a cover crop incentive directory and an edge of field incentive directory, which lists 15 and 18 programs. And these directories also include stacking matrix. So farmers can see if they're enrolled in one program, which programs they could stack on top to receive additional payments, or which programs they're sort of excluded from if they do enroll in a specific program. So you can find both of these on our website. We also have a directory of carbon market incentive programs. So we hear from farmers a lot that that's a really confusing space and trying to understand what are all the programs that are available to them and what are the differences between all of them. So that's also available on our website. And then stay tuned. This summer, we're planning to launch an online interactive, filterable, searchable tool that farmers can use to find incentive programs that will work for them. And it will include all of the programs that are currently listed on the cover crop directory, the edge of field directory, our carbon market directory, as well as all of the Partners for Climate Smart Commodities programs that are being rolled out in Illinois. So we plan to launch that this summer, so that you will stay in touch and get updates on that. And I think to just acknowledge one of the challenges that Rachel mentioned in not having adequate funding for some of these practices, we're now in like a historic moment of conservation funding. And so it's really important for us as a state to make good use of that funding and make sure that that's getting to farmers and making sure that we're supporting farmers in finding success with these practices that they are receiving payments for. If you are a landowner and you're working with your farmer on rented land, FarmDoc has developed a soil health and conservation addendum that you can use in lease agreements. So we encourage people to look into that and see how they can use their relationship with their farmer to encourage the use of these practices. And lastly, we encourage farmers to call or visit their local USDA service center to get started with the conservation program. Again, the service center is where the local experts are located, and the service centers are designed to be these single locations where customers can get access to services provided by the Farm Service Agency, NRCS, and other rural development agencies. It's often the same location as your SWCD, where you can sign up for cost share programs, you can enroll in the STAR program, and learn about their local events and field days. So there's a website where you can find the contact information for the service center in your county, and we suggest that farmers get in touch and get involved. And then I think I'll pass it back over to Rachel for a few resources that Extension has put together about the NLRS.
Thank you, Helen. So yes, Illinois Extension also has some resources that you can explore. First, the Illinois Extension Nutrient Loss Reduction website was just launched at the beginning of February. And so on the website, you can find a lot of content about the different sources and conservation practices, as well as the priority watersheds, the nutrient loss reduction strategy itself, and the other federal documents that play a role in our strategy, as well as the blog and podcast and upcoming extension events. So I mentioned the podcast. The podcast is co-produced by Todd Gleason, Nicole Haberback, and myself currently, and hopefully I saw Emma's on here, so hopefully she'll be joining us in this. Nicole and I also have created a supplemental blog to support the podcast, and that started back in December of 2022. So currently we have about, I think we just had our 60th podcast episode released, and we have 21 blog posts focused on the most recent podcast, as well as we're working on creating blog posts for previous podcast episodes, just as another way to get the information, all while we're keeping up with the most recent podcast episodes. And then Illinois Extension released a fact sheet about the NLRS and the ag conservation practices in July of this past year. And so you can find that either by going to the website or the QR code or the nutrient loss website. And it contains the tables that I highlighted in our different practices.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So yeah, now we'll shift into the Q&A. I'll dig back through in the chat here and see if we can start from the beginning, but encourage people to put any additional questions that you have in the chat that we can run through. So our first question from David, so Zinger, will you explain why you think the NLRS has been such a failure? Rachel, I don't know if you want to start. I could add some thoughts.
I mean, I wouldn't say that it's a failure. I think that we can say that we're not making the progress that we had hoped that we would be making. And there's a lot of contributing factors to that. The overall expense of getting these conservation practices implemented, the lag time between getting the practices implemented and seeing the nutrient loss reductions on a larger scale, but we are seeing progress being made on our local watershed scales. And that's what's really important to us here in Illinois, right? Like our water quality, being able to go out and play in the water and have safe drinking water. And that's all been improved because of the increase in the conservation practice adoptions that we're seeing, as well as, the progress that our wastewater treatment facilities are making. So I don't think it's been a complete failure. But I also want to say that we have room to grow. And Joan is on the call as well. So Joan, do you want to?
I was just going to piggyback a little bit on what you said. So when you look at the water quality data for Illinois, for nitrogen, while we still are above the baseline, if you correct the nitrogen for the stream flow amounts that have been more, you're seeing a trend downward on nitrogen, and that's reflected nationally as well. there's a downward trend on nitrogen. The rate at which it was increasing has slowed substantially. So, and that's reflected in the ag conservation practices too. We track various scenarios of ag conservation practices in Illinois. And if you look at the nutrient management practices, we're pretty close to what the interim goals were in some of those scenarios for the nutrient management practices, whereas we are quite far off from a few of the other ones like cover crops, which is a big one. Unlike nitrogen, phosphorus is increasing, even though the point source sector has made substantial decreases in the last 10 years. So and then there's a lot of factors going into that and a lot of research going into that too. So
thanks for those additions, Joan. And yeah, thanks for your question, David. I mean, I think it is fair to say that we're failing to meet the targets that have been established. And I think that it's easy to point to the scale of practice adoption. I think it's important to highlight the increases in practice adoption that we've seen and, you know, celebrate those wins and celebrate the farmers who have taken action. But I think that there's a lot of room for growth and expansion of those practices across the state. Let's see, next question. So Rachel, you mentioned in your presentation the backlog of conservation funding. Cassidy is wondering, is the backlog of conservation funding applications due to the lack of capacity, funding, or something else?
Okay, Joan, jump in if I misspeak, but it's due to both. Like, there are limitations based on the number of people that are able to actually implement these practices on the build the practice, but there's also a lack of funding, both at the state and federal level. So with the IRA and some other things that are going on, that there's the opportunity for some of those barriers to be reduced, but you know, time will tell by how much.
Yeah, and I think it's really a call to action. And now that there is all this funding available, making sure that we have the right people in place and the right capacity to make sure that the funding is getting to the partners. Let's see, our next question, I think this is for you, Rachel. Is USDA NRCS part of the government group that helps develop this strategy?
So the original strategy was developed and kind of led by the Illinois EPA and the Illinois Department of Ag. But NRCS is absolutely a part of the overall strategy and a part of the government groups that are a part of moving the strategy forward.
Cassidy's got a question. Are Illinois farmers accessing carbon markets? And are there any markets that financially support conservation practice implementation? So I think that probably went in before we hit the slide on the incentive directories. But yes, there are lots of programs available that are supporting practice implementation. ISAP has done a lot of work in the carbon market space. They released the sort of first overview of carbon market programs in 2021. And then, you know, the space has changed so much in the past couple of years. So last year we released an update to the carbon market program, and we've done a little bit of work of trying to understand, you know, why farmers are or are not interested in participating in those programs. So we've done a few surveys and have tried to sort of pinpoint what is the information gap that farmers are experiencing in order to be interested in participating in those programs. And we're working to develop some resources to address some of that. So I hope that answers your question, Cassidy. And yeah, there's more, you can find more information about the carbon market programs that are available in Illinois on our website as well. think that's all the questions in the chat. Are there any last minute questions people would like to add? Oh, here's one. To what extent are CAFOs contributing to nutrient runoff? That's concentrated animal feed operations. CAFO stands for. Rachel, do you want to?
Yeah, so I guess I haven't checked to see how many CAFOs are in Illinois that are regulated by the Illinois EPA in the most recent biennial report, but in the previous one, it was like 7. So, okay, you're welcome.
Betsy's asking, are there any incentives for conservation crop rotations? Sometimes the small grain, short-term perennial or intermediate oilseed crops prohibit cover crops. That's a great question. Yeah, I think a lot of the incentives that we've seen roll out are really focused on cover crops. I think that a lot of the programs under the Partners for Climate Smart Commodities, the opportunity for different practices seems pretty broad. So I haven't dug in to those specifically around conservation crop rotations, but I feel like it's pretty likely that those are included in some of those programs. And I think there might also be, I don't know if anyone else in the call knows, I think that is a practice that might potentially, that EQIP might potentially fund. Anyone know? Okay, hearing no interjections. But that's something, Betsy, that we're working to build into our financial incentives database that people can search and filter. And we want to ask, we want farmers to be able to say what practices they're currently doing and what practices they're interested in doing. And so that can kind of put together a list of programs that would fund for different practices. Good questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any others in the chat, but if people have more, we can always jump back to it as we're going through some of our wrap-up slides. So yeah, I just want to encourage everyone to stay in touch. As I mentioned, there's a few sort of upcoming things this summer that we have planned. We encourage people to, you know, stay in touch through our website, signing up for our newsletter. And then I also included my email and Rachel Curry's email there in case you want to get in touch about anything specifically that we mentioned. And just a couple plugs of things to look forward to. ISAP enrollment is open for the ISAP Soil Health Leadership Program. This is an 18-month advanced training program on soil health. This is the 6th cohort that ISAP will host. And the program will start in August, but the applications are now open and they'll close May 31st. The program is available to farmers, conservation professionals, retailers, farm advisors, sort of anyone who falls into those categories. And we're hoping to get a good mix across that. And you can apply on our website, ilsustainableag.org/SHLP. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to answer those. And then we'll also just encourage everyone to check out all the other presentations and events that are on the lineup this week. There's a great list of soil health events. And we just want to highlight 2 more that ISAP will be participating in. Thursday morning at 10 a.m. we'll be doing an introduction to the Soil Health Practices Guidebook, an overview of what information is included in that resource, and we'll also hear from a few of the farmers whose stories are featured in the guidebook. And then on Friday, ISAP Soil Health Specialist Jim Iserman will be facilitating a farmer panel with dairy farmers who are incorporating soil health practices into their farms as well. So we encourage you to sign up for other soil health week events, especially the ISAP ones. And yeah, looking forward to seeing you all throughout the week. And we'll give you 10 minutes back on this busy soil health week. thanks so much for coming.